The tension was suffocating. The engines of the plane hummed softly as it soared 30,000 feet above the ground. But inside, the air was thick with a sense of impending disaster. On one side of the aisle, a young black woman, Nina Roberts, sat in her VIP seat, her eyes locked on the large glass window as she tried to calm her nerves. Her fingers gripped the armrest tightly, as if the seatbelt around her waist wasn't enough to ground her. She had worked her entire life to get here, the flight to New York, the first-class seat, the soft, cushioned chair that she deserved. She had earned it. But then came the voice. The voice of a flight attendant, as sweet and practiced as she could be, but with an underlying tension that Nina couldn't quite shake. "Excuse me, miss," the flight attendant said, her tone polite but firm. "We need to ask you to switch seats with the gentleman over there in 2B. Nina blinked. Her brow furrowed. "What do you mean, switch?" she asked, her voice tentative, unsure. "I'm in my assigned seat." The flight attendant hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. "We've been informed that the man in 2B is a VIP client who has requested this specific seat. It's a matter of priority, I'm afraid." Nina felt her heart skip a beat. She glanced over at the man in 2B. His suit was sharp, his demeanor cold, like someone who expected everything to be handed to him on a silver platter. "Look," the flight attendant continued, "I understand this is unusual, but it's just for the duration of the flight. It's a special request." Nina's thoughts raced. She was exhausted. She had been looking forward to the comfort of this seat for the entire trip. But the way the attendant's eyes shifted, the pleading in her voice, it was clear she didn't have much of a choice. Her mind screamed, "This isn't right," but the reality was clear. She was being forced into submission. She stood up, glancing around at the other passengers. No one met her eyes. A feeling of isolation washed over her, making her stomach twist. Slowly, she gathered her things, her hands trembling. As she moved toward the smaller, less comfortable seat in the back of the plane, the cold man in 2B gave her a smug nod, his lips barely moving in acknowledgement. Once seated, Nina tried to settle in, but the unease wouldn't leave her. She could feel every pair of eyes on her, watching her. It was as though the entire plane had just witnessed a subtle injustice, and no one dared to speak up. Then, her phone buzzed. Nina glanced at the screen. It was an unknown number. She almost ignored it, but something told her to answer. "Hello." Nina spoke, trying to steady her voice. "Nina Roberts." The voice on the other end was low, firm. "Yes. I'm sorry to tell you that your entire team has just been fired. Effective immediately." Nina's stomach dropped. Her heart thundered in her chest. The words felt like a punch to the gut, but they didn't make sense. "What are you talking about?" Nina managed to choke out. "What team?" "I don't have a team." The voice didn't pause. "The ones you just walked away from. Your colleagues in business. They've been dismissed by the company," and the call cut off abruptly. Nina's mind spun. Who could be calling her like this? What team? She turned, looking out at the empty aisles and wondering who could possibly have this kind of power over her life. She checked her phone again. No new notifications. No new messages. Everything seemed surreal. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she noticed something strange. The man in 2B wasn't in his seat anymore. He had disappeared. Where did he go? She thought, and the unease she'd felt earlier came rushing back. She had a strange feeling she wasn't alone. That someone was watching her. And that was when she heard the voice again, this time, right beside her. "Excuse me, ma'am, could I have a moment of your time?" Nina turned, her breath catching in her throat. The man from 2B stood there, his cold eyes locked on hers. He was smiling now, but there was nothing friendly about it. He leaned in, lowering his voice to a whisper. "I think you've just made a very, very big mistake." Nina froze. The man's smile was unsettling, like a predator sizing up its prey. For a moment, she couldn't speak. Her mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. Everything from the forced seat switch to the mysterious phone call that had upended her life. Who are you?" Nina managed to whisper, her voice barely audible over the hum of the plane's engines. The man leaned in closer, his breath warm on her ear. "Let's just say I have a vested interest in your well-being, Nina. You're going to want to hear me out." Nina's heartbeat quickened. How does he know my name? Nina stuttered, her thoughts scrambling. What do you want from me? You can't just... He held up a hand, cutting her off, and sat down beside her in the cramped seat. His eyes scanned the cabin briefly before focusing back on her. What you don't understand, he continued, is that this isn't about a seat. It's about you. Nina's stomach churned. This was no ordinary passenger. No ordinary man. What do you mean? She asked, barely able to control the tremor in her voice. She had no idea who this man was or why he was talking to her like this. He leaned in even closer, his words dropping to a whisper. They're watching you, Nina. Everyone on this flight. They know exactly who you are. And I'm going to make sure you're the one who survives this. Nina blinked, trying to process what he was saying. Survive what? Before she could ask another question, the plane shook slightly. It wasn't unusual for a commercial flight to experience turbulence, but this felt different. More violent, more deliberate. The seatbelt sign blinked on, and the flight attendants rushed down the aisles, ensuring everyone fastened their belts. Nina couldn't take her eyes off the man. He had a look of cold calculation on his face, as though he knew exactly what was about to happen. Get ready, he said, his tone low. This is just the beginning. Nina's eyes widened. The unsettling feeling in her gut was escalating, and she had no idea what he meant. The turbulence increased, and Nina gripped her armrest, her knuckles turning white. Suddenly, the intercom crackled to life. A calm voice from the captain came through, but there was a strain in his words that made Nina's pulse spike. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've encountered some unexpected complications. Please remain in your seats and keep your seatbelt fastened. We'll keep you updated shortly. Something wasn't right. Complications? It didn't sound like the usual in-flight announcement. The man beside Nina didn't seem fazed by the turbulence. In fact, he looked almost pleased. A sickening smile curled at the corners of his lips. Nina's phone buzzed again. She grabbed it, desperate for some clarity. But this time, it wasn't just an unknown number. This time, it was a message. The clock is ticking. Get ready for the truth. Nina felt her blood run cold. Who was behind all of this? Why was she being dragged into this terrifying mess? She glanced at the man again, but he had already stood up, moving toward the front of the cabin. But as he did, he caught the eye of a flight attendant, who looked at him and nodded, almost like they were working together. Something clicked in Nina's mind. She had no idea what was going on, but the more she thought about it, the more she was convinced that this whole situation was far bigger than a simple seat switch. The plane jolted again, and this time, it was more violent. The overhead compartments rattled, and a few items fell to the floor with loud clatters. The cabin crew quickly rushed to ensure everyone was okay, but Nina could sense the fear in their movements. Something had gone horribly wrong. The man who had been seated in 2B turned and made his way down the aisle. But just before he reached the galley, he stopped and turned back to Nina. His eyes locked onto hers, filled with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. Whatever you do, he said, his voice a deadly whisper, don't trust anyone. Before Nina could respond, he was gone, vanishing into the back of the plane. The chaos escalated. Passengers began to murmur nervously, some clutching their armrests, others texting on their phones in a panic. The flight attendants, usually so calm and collected, were visibly shaken. Nina's head was spinning. She needed answers. Fast. As she leaned forward in her seat, her phone buzzed once more. Another message, this time from an unknown number. You're being tested. Your decisions from here on out will determine everything. A cold sweat broke out across Nina's forehead. Tested? What was she supposed to do with this information? She wasn't trained for something like this. She wasn't a spy or a secret agent. She was just a woman trying to make her way in the world. Her thoughts were interrupted by a loud bang from the cockpit, followed by a muffled shout. The passengers gasped, and the murmurs grew louder. Nina shot to her feet, instinctively moving toward the front of the plane. She had to know what was going on. She needed to find out who was behind all of this. But as she approached the cockpit, the door opened suddenly. A flight attendant, pale and shaking, rushed out and stopped dead in her tracks when she saw Nina. "You can't go in there," the attendant hissed, her voice full of panic. Before Nina could respond, the man from 2B appeared behind the attendant. He grabbed Nina's arm and yanked her back. "Go back to your seat," he ordered coldly. Nina stood frozen, her heart racing. What is happening? As the man's grip tightened on her arm, a sudden realization hit Nina. Whatever this was, it was only just beginning. Nina's mind was racing. The man's grip on her arm was firm, unyielding. His cold eyes bore into hers, and for a moment, she thought she might faint. The air around them seemed to thicken, every breath a struggle. The entire flight felt like it was on the verge of spiraling into complete chaos. "Let me go," Nina demanded, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and frustration. The man didn't flinch. "You're not thinking straight," he said in that same cold, detached tone. "Go back to your seat." "No." Nina opened her mouth to argue, but then she looked down the aisle. The flight attendants were watching her. Their eyes were filled with fear, but no one stepped forward to help. It was like they were afraid of something, or someone. The man didn't give her time to think. He began walking her back to her seat, each step more forceful than the last. Her mind was a blur of questions. What was going on? Why was he so insistent on keeping her in her seat? And why was everyone acting so strange? "Tell me what's happening," Nina cried, but her voice was lost in the rising noise of the passengers' murmurs. The turbulence had increased again, and the shaking of the plane was enough to make anyone uneasy. But it wasn't just the turbulence that had Nina on edge, it was the sudden, chilling sense that something was terribly wrong. The man didn't answer. He simply guided her back to her seat and sat down beside her once again. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The other passengers were increasingly nervous, some clutching the armrests, others whispering to each other in hushed tones. The flight attendant who had been closest to the cockpit appeared in the aisle, her face pale, her steps hurried. She was clearly trying to keep the situation under control, but Nina could see the fear in her eyes. This wasn't business as usual. The man in 2B, whoever he was, wasn't fazed by the growing panic. He sat with his arms crossed, looking perfectly at ease, as if the chaos swirling around them didn't concern him in the slightest. Nina swallowed hard, forcing herself to look away from him. She didn't want to be near him. She didn't want to be part of whatever twisted game was unfolding. She needed answers. She needed to understand why she was being dragged into this mess. Suddenly, the intercom crackled to life again, and this time, it wasn't the captain's voice that came through. It was a distorted voice, almost robotic, with a digital echo that made it hard to make out the words. "Attention, all passengers. We are experiencing an unexpected delay. Please remain seated and stay calm. This is for your own safety." The announcement ended abruptly, and the cabin went silent. Nina looked at the man in 2B. His expression had changed. He was no longer smiling. In fact, there was a hard edge to his features that made him look even more dangerous than before. "What was that?" Nina whispered, her heart pounding. "Get used to it," the man replied quietly, not meeting her eyes. "This is only the beginning." Nina's breath caught in her throat. The entire flight was off-kilter. Every instinct screamed at her to get off the plane, to run, but she couldn't. The doors were locked, and the flight attendants were on edge, as if they were being forced to follow someone else's orders. A sudden loud thud came from the cockpit, followed by muffled shouting. The flight attendants looked at each other in panic, their faces pale, but no one moved toward the cockpit. Something was going wrong, and it was clear they didn't know how to fix it. Nina's phone buzzed again. "Time is running out. Don't trust anyone." Nina clenched her fists. Whoever was behind this mess wasn't just messing with her, they were messing with everyone on this flight. She had to do something. She couldn't sit by and wait. But what could she do? The man in 2B had said that she was being tested. What did that mean? And what role did she play in all of this? Was there a plan? She turned to the man, her voice desperate. "Why me?" she asked. "Why am I involved in this?" The man's eyes flickered to hers, then back to the front of the plane. "You really don't get it, do you?" he said, his voice low and almost mocking. "You're the only one who can fix this. And believe me, if you don't, we're all in trouble." Nina's head was spinning. She wanted to shout, to scream, but the words didn't come. Everything around her felt surreal, like she was trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. She glanced around. The flight attendants were huddled together, whispering urgently, but no one looked like they were in control. Passengers were growing more restless, their anxiety reaching a boiling point. The turbulence kept shaking the plane, and the sense of dread in the air was palpable. Nina's phone buzzed again. "There's a limited window. Make your choice. Make your choice." The words echoed in her mind. What choice? She didn't even know what was going on. But whatever it was clear that something had gone horribly wrong, and Nina was somehow at the center of it all. Suddenly, there was another loud bang from the cockpit, followed by the unmistakable sound of the door slamming open. The flight attendants scattered, but one of them, an older woman, rushed down the aisle toward Nina. "Miss Roberts," the woman said urgently, her voice trembling. "You need to come with me now." Nina's stomach twisted. Who was this woman? What was she hiding? The man in 2B stood up abruptly and stepped between Nina and the flight attendant. "No. She stays where she is," he said, his voice cold and unwavering. Nina felt a cold shiver run down her spine. Who could this man be? Before she could react, another flight attendant rushed over, visibly panicked. "We need to get everyone to the back of the plane." "No." And just like that, the chaos began to escalate. The flight attendants were scrambling, pulling passengers to the back of the cabin. But it wasn't just panic. Something was definitely wrong, and Nina could sense that the worst was still to come. As the passengers were herded toward the back, Nina turned to the man in 2B, her voice barely more than a whisper. "What is going on? What is happening to us?" His lips curled into a cold, knowing smile. "Hold on tight, Nina. This is only the beginning." The tension was suffocating. Nina felt like she couldn't breathe, the weight of the situation pressing down on her chest with each passing second. The flight attendants were rushing down the aisles, ushering people toward the back of the plane. Passengers were confused, murmuring in anxious tones, some asking if there was a problem with the plane, while others just followed orders without question. Nina couldn't help but wonder, why her? Why was she at the center of all this? She glanced over at the man in 2B. He was still standing, arms crossed, his cold eyes watching the chaos unfold with an unsettling calmness. His face hadn't changed, but there was something almost predatory in the way he observed the passengers. One of the flight attendants, a young woman with dark circles under her eyes, approached Nina and tried to pull her up. "We need you to come with us. Please. It's for your safety." Nina pulled back, heart racing. "What's going on?" she demanded. "What's happening? Why are we being moved to the back?" The attendant hesitated, glancing around nervously. I can't explain right now. Just please trust us." Nina looked toward the front of the plane. The cockpit door was open, and 2 other flight attendants had gathered there, talking in hushed tones. The words emergency and protocol were all Nina could catch, and the panic that was rising within her escalated with every passing second. Was the plane in danger? Her mind raced, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something much more sinister was at play. The man from 2B was moving now, making his way toward the front of the plane, his steps measured and purposeful. As he passed by, his eyes locked onto Nina's, and he nodded once, as if confirming something she wasn't yet aware of. "Stay where you are," he said softly, almost as if he were giving her a warning. "It's almost time." Nina's stomach turned. What was he talking about? Was he in on whatever was happening? Or worse, was he the one causing it? The young flight attendant, still holding onto Nina's arm, pulled her away from her thoughts. "We have to move now," she urged. Nina stood reluctantly, but her mind was still spinning. The messages on her phone, the strange behavior of the crew, the cryptic warnings from the man in 2B, nothing was adding up. As Nina made her way toward the back of the plane, she overheard snippets of frantic conversation from the flight attendants. "It's not supposed to happen this way. The sequence was never meant to be triggered. Get her to the back. Keep her away from the cockpit." The words were rushed, almost incoherent, as if they were speaking a language that Nina couldn't quite understand. But one thing was clear, they were all trying to hide something from her. At the rear of the plane, the flight attendants formed a semicircle around Nina. No one else was around, and the rest of the passengers had been ushered toward the front. The silence in the back was deafening, punctuated only by the sound of Nina's own breath. The flight attendant who had first approached her looked at her with wide, terrified eyes. "Listen to me, Nina. You have to stay here. Whatever happens next, you need to stay out of it." Nina's heart pounded in her chest. "What's going on? What are you talking about?" But before the attendant could answer, the plane lurched violently. The air was sucked out of the cabin, and the passengers' screams filled the space. Nina was thrown forward into the nearest seat, her stomach churning as the plane dipped and swayed wildly. The overhead compartments rattled violently, and one of them popped open, spilling luggage onto the floor. The sudden drop in altitude made Nina's ears pop, and her vision blurred as the plane jolted again. "Everyone hold on!" a flight attendant shouted as she rushed down the aisle. But her voice didn't sound like an order, it was panicked, desperate. Nina tried to stand, but the turbulence was relentless. She could barely keep her balance as the plane seemed to drop lower and lower. There was a horrible, grinding sound, like metal against metal, and then a sudden burst of static came through the intercom. "We are experiencing critical failure," the captain's voice crackled, strained and distorted. "Please remain calm. We are trying to stabilize the plane." Critical failure? Nina's heart raced as the panic spread through the cabin. What was happening? Was the plane going to crash? Before Nina could process the captain's words, another flight attendant came rushing down the aisle. She was visibly shaken, her face pale. "We need to move now," she urged, grabbing Nina's arm. "What's happening?" Nina demanded again, her voice rising with panic. "What's going on?" "We don't have time for this," the attendant said, her voice trembling. "You need to come with me. Now." The man from 2B reappeared at the front of the cabin, his eyes scanning the scene with cold precision. His lips curled into a smile as if he had been waiting for something. "You need to get her out of here," he said, his voice low. "It's almost time. She's the one who can stop it." The attendant shook her head. "We can't. She doesn't even know." The man stepped forward, his voice cold. "Do you want everyone to die? Because that's what happens if she doesn't act now." Nina's pulse pounded in her ears. "Act now." Before the attendant could respond, the entire plane dropped again, this time more violently than before. The screams grew louder as the passengers struggled to hold onto their seats. The lights flickered, and the plane seemed to shudder as if it were on the brink of falling apart. Nina felt the ground beneath her feet give way. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. She could only hold on as the man in 2B moved toward her with purpose. His eyes locked onto hers with a certainty that terrified her. "Are you ready, Nina?" he asked. Nina had no idea what was happening, but one thing was clear. Her life was no longer in her hands. Nina's hands gripped the armrest so tightly her knuckles turned white. The plane's violent shakes had her heart racing in a way she never thought possible. This isn't just turbulence, she thought, as her breath quickened. Something is wrong. Something is terribly wrong. The man in 2B was now standing right in front of her, his cold eyes never leaving hers. His presence was almost suffocating. He seemed to know exactly what was happening, and yet he wasn't scared. The passengers were in chaos, some of them crying out, others praying. But the man seemed unfazed, as if all of this was part of some twisted plan. "Stay calm, Nina," he said softly, his voice carrying an eerie calmness that only made her more uneasy. "You're the key. You're the only one who can stop this." Nina could hardly comprehend his words. "What do you mean, I'm the key?" Her mind was spiraling, trying to piece together the puzzle that made no sense. How was she supposed to stop something that she didn't even understand? Why was this man, this stranger, placing this responsibility on her? "What are you talking about?" Nina's voice cracked with frustration and fear. "I'm not the key to anything. I just want to get off this plane and go home." The man's gaze softened, but only for a moment. "You have no idea what you've walked into, Nina. You're more involved than you think." The plane lurched again, throwing Nina against the seatbelt. She could hear the metallic screeching from somewhere in the back of the plane, followed by more frantic cries from the passengers. The flight attendants had retreated, hiding in the galley, their faces pale as ghosts. "We don't have time," the man said, his voice tight with urgency. You need to make a choice. The situation is escalating. Before Nina could respond, the overhead lights flickered. The plane shook again, harder this time, and a loud boom echoed from below. The noise sounded like an explosion, and the entire cabin seemed to lurch upward. Passengers screamed, some standing up, frantic and desperate for answers. The intercom buzzed again, but it was distorted, and the words were barely audible. Nina could make out just a few fragmented sentences. All units, code, activated, procedure, ensure, containment. But the rest was lost in static. Nina's pulse spiked. She looked back at the man, her mind spinning with questions. Containment, procedure. The man's eyes narrowed, and he stepped closer to her, his face inches from hers. You don't have much time, Nina. They're about to take over. You have to make a choice. Nina looked around the cabin, at the fearful faces of the other passengers. She could see the flight attendants huddled together, whispering frantically. The plane's violent shakes had become almost unbearable, and the man's words rang in her head like a warning siren. Choice? What choice? A loud crash came from the front of the plane, and for a moment, everything stopped. The passengers' screaming ceased, and a cold silence settled over the cabin. But it wasn't the kind of silence that was comforting. It was the kind that made your skin crawl, the kind where you knew something terrible was about to happen. Nina's heart raced. She had to do something. She couldn't just sit there and wait for whatever was coming. The man in 2B was the only one who seemed to know what was happening, and she had to figure out what part she was supposed to play in all of this. What am I supposed to do? Nina asked, her voice trembling. Tell me what to do. I don't understand. The man studied her for a moment, then glanced toward the back of the plane, where the flight attendants were still gathered. They looked terrified, and Nina could sense their fear wasn't just from the turbulence. It was something else entirely. Get to the cockpit, the man said, his voice low and urgent. You have to get there before they do. Nina's mind reeled. The cockpit? Who are you talking about? Who's going to the cockpit? He didn't answer directly. Instead, he turned and began walking toward the front of the plane. Come with me now. No time to waste. Nina hesitated for a moment, the weight of the decision pressing on her chest. But the urgency in his voice pushed her into action. She stood up, her legs shaky, and followed him through the chaotic cabin. The plane shook again, sending passengers stumbling and crashing into seats. As they moved toward the front, Nina noticed the flight attendants. They were no longer simply fearful, they were terrified. Their eyes darted nervously toward the cockpit, and when they saw Nina walking toward it, their expressions changed. One of them mouthed something to her. Don't go there. You have no idea what you're doing. But it was too late. Nina had already made her decision. Whatever was going on, whatever had brought her into this nightmare, she had to confront it head-on. They reached the cockpit door, but as Nina reached for the handle, a voice came over the intercom once more, but this time it was clear. It wasn't distorted or full of static. All personnel on board, prepare for immediate lockdown. The flight is now in containment mode. Nina's heart skipped a beat. Containment mode? What did that even mean? Before she could react, the man from 2B turned to her. His eyes were colder than ever. It's happening. They're not letting us out. His voice was eerily calm. Once the lockdown is in place, there's no going back. Nina's hand trembled as she reached for the door to the cockpit. But before she could turn the knob, the door flung open, and a group of men, dressed in dark suits, burst into the cabin. Their faces were stern, expressionless, and their eyes locked onto Nina with a terrifying intensity. The man in 2B stepped in front of her, a protective stance that made Nina's heart race with anxiety. But then, to her shock, he turned and addressed the men. I told you she's the one, he said calmly. One of the men in the suits stepped forward. And you're sure? She hasn't triggered the protocol yet. The man in 2B nodded, his expression unreadable. She's the key. She has to decide. Nina's head spun. The word protocol echoed in her mind, but she couldn't make sense of it. What did they mean by triggering it? What was her role in all of this? The man in 2B looked at Nina one last time before the door to the cockpit slammed shut behind a group of men. And that's when she heard it, The unmistakable sound of the plane locking down. The lights flickered again, and the engines suddenly roared to life in a way that felt different. Nina's legs felt like jelly, and she stumbled back into her seat, her mind racing. She had no idea what was happening, but one thing was for certain: it was too late to turn back now. The sound of the plane's engines roaring was deafening, and Nina's head throbbed as she sank into her seat. She had no idea what was going on anymore. The men in the suits had disappeared into the cockpit, leaving behind only an unsettling silence that felt heavier than anything she had ever experienced. The other passengers were visibly shaken, their faces pale with fear, their eyes darting around in confusion. The flight attendants, who had been frantic moments earlier, were now strangely quiet. It was as if they were waiting for something Nina wasn't yet privy to. She couldn't sit still. The weight of the situation was too much to bear. She needed answers. But all she could do was stare at the locked cockpit door, her mind swirling with possibilities. The plane felt different now. The sense of urgency in the air had shifted, and now there was a cold, eerie calm hanging over everything. The man in 2B had told her to make a choice. He had said she was the key. But to what? What was she supposed to do? She glanced at her phone again, hoping for some kind of guidance. But there were no new messages, no new calls. Only the same chilling silence that had been suffocating her for the last hour. Nina's eyes shifted to the back of the plane, where she could see a few passengers nervously glancing at each other. Some were still trying to figure out what was happening, others were gripping their armrests, their faces twisted in fear. It was as if the entire cabin had been overtaken by an unseen force, and no one knew how to fight back. "You have to decide." The words from the man in 2B echoed in her mind, pulling her attention back to him. She turned her head and saw him standing in the aisle again. His expression was different this time, no longer the cool, collected figure he had been, but someone who was waiting for something. Waiting for her, maybe. Nina's breath caught in her throat. "He's waiting for me to do something." The man in 2B approached her slowly, his eyes dark and intense. "Nina, you've been given a choice," he said, his voice low but steady. "This isn't just about a seat or a plane ride. This is about the future. The decisions you make now will affect everything. You can't just sit back and hope this will blow over. You have to act." Nina clenched her fists, trying to steady her breathing. "What am I supposed to do? How do I stop this?" she asked, her voice desperate. The man's gaze softened for a brief moment. "You're more important than you realize. This plane, these people, they're all part of a larger plan. But it's your decision whether or not to stop it." Her heart hammered in her chest. Stop what? She could feel the sweat beading on her forehead. The weight of the situation, the secrecy, the sense of doom pressing in from every direction. It was overwhelming. "You'll know soon enough," he replied, his voice low. "But you need to make up your mind before we reach the final phase." Nina's head swam. The final phase? What final phase? She asked, her words trembling. What happens then? The man didn't answer. Instead, he glanced toward the cockpit and then back at Nina. It's too late for questions. The plane's been locked down, but there's still time to stop it. A sense of urgency surged through Nina. What do I need to do? Before she could react, the intercom crackled to life. This time, the captain's voice was sharp, but strained. Attention all passengers. This is your captain speaking. We are currently in lockdown mode. Please remain seated and refrain from leaving your seats. The situation is under control. We'll keep you updated shortly. Nina's stomach dropped. Lockdown mode? Under control? It sounded like the captain was trying to calm the passengers, but there was something in his voice, something off, something that didn't sit right with her. The fear in the cabin had only grown since the announcement, and now it felt as if the entire plane was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Nina looked back at the man in 2B. He was still watching her, his expression unreadable. He could see the confusion and fear in her eyes, but he wasn't offering any answers. He was waiting for her to make the next move. She looked back toward the cockpit. There was something beyond that door. She could feel it. The air felt charged with an energy she couldn't explain. And if she didn't act soon, she feared it would all spiral beyond her control. Suddenly, the plane jolted again, the sudden shift making Nina gasp for air. The lights flickered, and then everything went black. For a brief moment, it felt like the world had stopped moving, like the very fabric of reality had been torn apart. But then, the emergency lights flickered to life, casting a dim red glow over the cabin. The passengers were all silent, staring at the glowing lights, their faces illuminated in the eerie crimson hue. The only sound was the faint hum of the engines. Then the intercom came to life once again, but this time, it wasn't the captain's voice. It was a voice Nina didn't recognize, cold, mechanical, almost robotic. The words it spoke chilled her to the core. Initiating containment protocol. Phase 1 complete. Final phase will commence upon arrival. Nina's blood ran cold. Final phase. Was this it? Was this the point of no return? She glanced at the man in 2B again. His face was set, determined, as though he knew exactly what was coming. And yet, there was something else in his eyes, something that hinted at regret, or maybe fear. Nina took a deep breath, her heart pounding. It was now or never. "You said I had to make a choice," she said, her voice steady despite the fear. "What do I do?" The man in 2B didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned and started walking toward the cockpit door. "Come with me. You need to see this for yourself." Without another word, Nina stood up, her legs shaky but determined. She had no more questions, no more time. The answers, whatever they were in front of her. And as she moved toward the cockpit, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was a point of no return. Nina's legs wobbled beneath her as she followed the man in 2B toward the cockpit. Her mind raced with a million questions, but one question loomed above all others. What happens when we reach the final phase? She had no idea what was waiting for her on the other side of that cockpit door. The air was thick with tension, and every step felt heavier than the last. The other passengers were still eerily silent, their faces illuminated by the red emergency lights that now bathed the cabin in a ghostly glow. The man in 2B didn't speak as they moved, his eyes fixed ahead, unblinking, focused. Nina tried to keep up, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted answers, but she feared what she might learn. The closer they got to the cockpit, the more she could feel the weight of the decision she had to make pressing down on her shoulders. They reached the door. The man in 2B didn't hesitate. He pressed a button next to the cockpit door, and with a soft click, the door slid open. Inside, the cockpit was dark, save for a series of blinking red lights. The two pilots were seated in their chairs, their faces grim and taut with concentration. But when they saw Nina and the man in 2B, their expressions shifted. No longer the composed professionals that Nina had seen during her flight, but something else entirely. They looked afraid. "Get her back," one of the pilots said, his voice sharp. He stood up as if to block Nina from entering further, but the man in 2B moved quickly, stepping between them. "No," he said, his voice low, controlled. "She's the one. It's time." The second pilot glanced at the first, then at Nina, his face pale. "We don't have much time," he said, his voice cracking with tension. "If she doesn't make the call now, it's over." Nina's heart skipped a beat. The call? What did they mean? The man in 2B turned to Nina. "You're the one who can stop this. But you need to make the choice." Nina's mind was spinning. She was in the cockpit of a plane that was in the midst of some kind of containment protocol, and the pilots were now telling her she had to make a decision that could affect everything. She didn't know what was happening, but it was clear that this was the moment. Whatever was going to happen next was going to change everything. "What choice?" Nina asked, her voice barely a whisper. The first pilot turned his head away as if he couldn't bear to look at her. The second pilot's hands were shaking as he adjusted the controls. "The final phase," he said, his voice barely audible. "It can't be stopped unless you make the right decision." The man in 2B stepped forward, his eyes intense. "You need to decide whether to override the system. If you don't, we'll lose control. And the plane will crash." The words hit Nina like a physical blow. Crash. Her blood ran cold. The man in 2B was calm, but the pilots, their fear was palpable. Nina swallowed hard, her throat dry. Override the system? She could barely comprehend what she was hearing. "What system? What are you talking about? You're telling me that if I don't do this, the plane will crash?" The man nodded, his gaze unwavering. "This plane has been rigged with a fail-safe system. If it activates, we're done for. You're the only one who can stop it." Nina's eyes flicked between the man and the two pilots. The weight of their words settled on her like a mountain. Her mind was racing, her thoughts scattered. She had no idea how to override anything. She wasn't a pilot. She didn't even know how a plane worked. But the man in 2B was right about one thing: this was it. This was her moment to either save everyone or doom them all. "Tell me how," Nina said, her voice steady despite the chaos swirling inside her. The second pilot looked up, his eyes filled with desperation. "The override switch is right there." He pointed to a large red button on the console in front of him. It looked too simple, too easy. It seemed out of place for something that could mean life or death. Nina hesitated, her hand hovering over the button. The plane shook again, harder this time, and Nina nearly lost her balance. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the cockpit. She turned to the man in 2B, her eyes searching his face for any sign that she was doing the right thing. "What happens if I press it?" she asked, her voice a whisper. He met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "You'll have to trust me." But trust wasn't something Nina could give easily, not in a moment like this. Still, she had no other choice. The alternative was unthinkable. Her fingers trembled as they hovered over the button. The plane lurched again, this time with a violent force that sent Nina stumbling forward. She gripped the console to steady herself. Without warning, the intercom crackled to life again. The robotic voice filled the cockpit. "Final phase initiated. All units, prepare for deployment." The words sent a chill down Nina's spine. Deployment? What was that? The man in 2B's eyes hardened. "Press the button now. You don't have much time." Nina took a deep breath, her fingers trembling as she pressed the button. The moment her finger made contact with the switch, the cockpit erupted into chaos. A loud, deafening alarm sounded, and the entire plane seemed to shudder as if something inside had been triggered. The pilots scrambled at the controls, their faces pale, but they were too late. The intercom voice came back, distorted this time, its words garbled but clear enough to make Nina's stomach churn. "System override failed. Initiating final phase." The cabin went dark. The lights shut off entirely. For a moment, Nina couldn't see anything. It felt like the world had plunged into complete and utter darkness. And then the plane dropped. Everything that wasn't strapped down flew into the air. Passengers screamed in terror, their voices drowning out the sound of the engines. The turbulence was unlike anything Nina had ever felt before. It wasn't just a bump in the air, it was a violent, uncontrollable descent. Nina's heart slammed in her chest. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. And in that moment, she realized something. It wasn't over. It had only just begun. The world was spinning. Nina's breath caught in her throat as the plane plummeted. Her body was weightless, suspended for a brief second in the chaos. She could hear the screams of the passengers around her, the noise piercing through the deafening roar of the engines. The seatbelt had no hold on her, and she was being tossed around like a rag doll. The lights were still out. The emergency lights flickered faintly, casting everything in an eerie, dim red glow. The plane's violent shaking was so intense that Nina had to grip the seat in front of her, trying to steady herself, but it was no use. The air felt thick, suffocating, and she could feel the cold sweat on her skin. "What have I done?" The man in 2B had told her to press the button, that it was the only way to stop the plane from crashing. But now everything seemed worse. The systems had failed. The final phase had been initiated. The alarms were blaring, and the descent wasn't slowing. "Brace for impact," came a voice over the intercom, but it wasn't the captain's voice. It was distorted, almost mechanical, just like the one that had issued the ominous warnings earlier. Nina's mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest. Brace for impact. Was this really it? Was the plane going down for good? She could hear the turbulence ripping through the cabin, the heavy sound of metal bending, and then, something worse. A violent crash rattled the entire plane as the wheels of the landing gear slammed into something hard. The screech of the metal against the runway was deafening, followed by the deafening screech of the tires as the plane's speed was finally halted. Everything was shaking. The plane lurched forward. The screaming grew louder. Nina's vision was blurry from the force of the impact. Her seatbelt tightened against her chest, but she still felt like she was being dragged through the air. She could barely see anything. The cabin was filled with chaos. The other passengers were frantically trying to get to the exits, but the emergency exits wouldn't open. The door to the cockpit was sealed. There was no way out. Nina's heart pounded. She could barely breathe, but somehow, in the midst of the panic, she thought she saw the man in 2B. He was standing in the aisle, watching the disaster unfold around him with a cold, impassive stare. "How?" Nina managed to gasp, her voice shaking. "How are we still alive?" The man in 2B didn't answer immediately. He simply watched the chaos, his lips pressed into a tight line. Then, after a long pause, he turned to Nina and spoke, his voice calm amidst the madness. "You did it, Nina," he said, his voice carrying a strange note of finality. "But the question now is, what happens next?" Before Nina could respond, another screech came from the cockpit, followed by the unmistakable sound of the door being forced open. The two pilots stumbled out, their faces pale and covered in sweat. They were shaking. The second pilot looked directly at Nina, his eyes wide with panic. "It's too late," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the screams of the passengers. "The protocol. It can't be stopped now." "Protocol," Nina repeated, her voice hoarse. "What protocol? You said I was supposed to stop it. You said I could fix it." The first pilot grabbed her arm, his face frantic. "You don't understand, Nina. The plane. It's only part of the plan. The real protocol isn't just about the plane. It's about everything." Nina's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" But before the pilot could answer, the cabin door burst open. A group of men in dark suits stormed into the cabin, their eyes scanning the chaos around them. They moved swiftly and efficiently, as though they knew exactly what to do. The man in 2B didn't flinch. He stepped aside, allowing them to pass. The leader of the group, tall, imposing, his face expressionless, approached Nina. His eyes were sharp, calculating. "Nina Roberts," he said coldly, "you've played your part. But now, you need to come with us." Nina stepped back instinctively. Who were these people? What was going on? What was this plan that she had somehow become tangled in? "No," she said, her voice shaking but defiant. "I don't know what's happening, but I'm not going anywhere with you." The man's cold eyes never left hers. "You don't have a choice, Miss Roberts," he said quietly. "You never did." Nina looked around at the wreckage. The cabin was in shambles, the seats scattered and overturned, and the emergency exits still locked. The chaos was still unfolding around her, but something told her that the real danger wasn't over. The man in 2B stepped forward then, his voice low. "It's not over, Nina. Not by a long shot. The real game has only just begun." Nina's mind reeled. What game? The man in the dark suit looked over at the man in 2B and nodded once, signaling to his men. "Prepare the final phase." "Final phase," Nina whispered, her heart racing. What was happening? What did he mean? The group of men began to move around the cabin, pulling out equipment, checking their watches, and whispering among themselves. They were preparing for something, but what? The man in 2B turned to Nina, his gaze hard. "You can't stop it now. Not anymore. But you can choose what happens next. You still have a choice, Nina. You can either join us, or you can be left behind." Nina's head spun. She could barely think, let alone make any decision about what had just happened. But one thing was clear, she had crossed a line. There was no going back now. Suddenly, an explosion rang out from the back of the plane, loud enough to shake the walls. The passengers screamed again. And Nina knew, in that moment, that everything had changed. The explosion had thrown the entire cabin into chaos. The sound echoed through the plane like a thunderclap. It rattled the walls, the windows, and the very floor beneath Nina's feet. The force of it threw her to the ground, knocking the breath out of her. The lights flickered again, casting everything in a strobe-like pattern as screams filled the air. Nina scrambled to her feet, her heart racing. The man in 2B was already moving, stepping over the scattered debris and headed toward the rear of the cabin, where the explosion had originated. His movements were calm, purposeful, like he had expected this to happen. The group of men in dark suits had spread out, securing the area and ushering people away from the danger zone. The first pilot, looking horrified, was trying to help a passenger who had been injured in the blast. The second pilot was shouting something to the flight attendants, but their voices were drowned out by the chaos. No one seemed to know what to do, but everyone knew one thing for sure: the situation was escalating rapidly. Nina felt a sense of dread creep through her chest. What had she just walked into? The final phase had been initiated. The protocol had been triggered. And now, it seemed like everything was coming apart at the seams. The man in 2B was the only one who seemed unaffected by the chaos. He reached the back of the cabin and stopped. There, near the rear exit, were two of the men in suits, working quickly to deploy something: equipment, monitors, strange devices that Nina didn't recognize. They were setting up some kind of system. The man in 2B turned back to her, catching her eye, and then looked at the men with the equipment. His face was expressionless. "The final phase is upon us, Nina," he said, his voice firm but oddly detached. "You still have a role to play." Nina's mind was a blur. A role? What role? She felt the cold grip of panic tighten around her chest. The plane was descending further. The emergency lights were now a constant, pulsing red, adding to the sense of urgency that was mounting by the second. "What do you mean, a role?" Nina asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What am I supposed to do?" The man in 2B didn't answer right away. He simply watched the men in suits, his face hard. "You've been chosen, Nina. You were the one who activated the override. You're the one who triggered the protocol. But now, you must decide how it ends." Nina's blood ran cold. How it ends? She looked toward the rear of the plane again. The explosion had caused significant damage, but the men in suits seemed to be working with calm precision, unaffected by the chaos. They were setting up what looked like a transmitter. "What are they doing?" Nina asked, her voice trembling. "What are they preparing?" "They're preparing for what comes next," the man in 2B replied quietly. "You've already taken the first step. But now, you need to choose: join them or stop them." Nina felt the weight of his words crash down on her. Join them, stop them. Before she could process it, the intercom crackled to life again. This time, it wasn't the captain's voice. It was the robotic voice from earlier, cold and mechanical. "Protocol complete. Final phase deployment imminent. All passengers are to remain in their seats and await instructions." Nina's stomach twisted in knots. What final phase? What was going to happen? The man in 2B took a step toward the rear of the cabin, his eyes scanning the passengers, who were still huddled in their seats, some too frightened to move. "You need to understand something, Nina. What you did, it set things in motion. But the final phase can either be a resolution, or it can be a disaster." Nina's eyes darted back to the group of men in suits, who were now positioning the transmitter. They seemed to be synchronizing something, perhaps a countdown? The screen in front of them blinked, a series of numbers appearing, ticking down steadily. "What happens when it reaches 0? Nina asked, her voice barely audible. "They've activated a countdown," the man in 2B replied, his voice cold. "If you don't act now, it'll trigger a broadcast that will change everything." Nina's heart stopped. A broadcast? What kind of broadcast? He stepped closer to her, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "This broadcast, Nina, is a message to the world. And it's one that can't be stopped. You can stop it if you take control. You can either join them and be part of the new world they want to create, or you can stop them and save everyone. But it'll come at a cost." A cold sweat broke out on Nina's forehead. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Join them? What did they want to create? The weight of the decision crashed down on her like a ton of bricks. She had no idea who these men were, what they wanted. She didn't know what this broadcast was or what it would do to the world. She didn't even know if she could stop it. But one thing was clear: she was standing at the edge of something far bigger than she could ever have imagined. The countdown on the screen reached the final seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2. Nina felt a tightness in her chest as she stared at the screen. The men in suits were watching her, waiting for her decision. There was no going back now. She had to choose. Would she join them, become part of whatever plan they had, or would she take a stand and risk everything to stop it? Her mind raced as the final seconds ticked away. The fate of the world seemed to hang in the balance, and it was up to her to decide. The countdown clock was ticking. 1. Nina's heart thudded in her chest, the pulse pounding so loud it felt like it was reverberating through her body. Her mind was spinning in circles, grasping for any shred of clarity, but nothing made sense. Nothing. The world, her life, everything she had ever known was hanging by a thread. The men in suits stood motionless, waiting, their eyes fixed on her. The man in 2B, the one who had been guiding her through this nightmare, watched her intently, his face expressionless. But there was something else behind his eyes now, a flicker of urgency. "Nina, you have to choose." The words echoed in her head. She could either stop it, or join them. 2. The countdown continued. She could feel her body trembling. Her hand hovered over the controls of the transmitter, the keys glowing faintly in the dim emergency light. Join them? What did that mean? Would she become part of their world? A world that seemed so dark, so dangerous, one that was willing to put an entire plane, an entire group of people, at risk for a cause she didn't even understand? But what if she stopped them? Could she even stop them? Did she have the power to? The second pilot's words rang in her mind. The plane. It's only part of the plan. The real protocol isn't just about the plane. It's about everything. Her breath hitched. The world. Everything. What would happen if the countdown hit 0? What would this broadcast do? 1. Nina's hand shot forward. She slapped her palm onto the control panel, slamming her hand on the button. Her entire body seemed to freeze as she watched the numbers hit 0. And for a split second, there was nothing. Complete, horrifying silence. Then the screen in front of her flashed to life. A message began to scroll, quick, cryptic words that Nina could barely keep up with. Words that would change everything. It wasn't a broadcast for the world, it was a signal. A signal that would activate dormant systems. System reactivated. Initiating global network interface. Nina's heart dropped. This was it. This wasn't just some broadcast. It was a global trigger, something much bigger than she could have imagined. The men in suits turned toward her, their expressions cold and calculating. The man in 2B stepped closer, his voice calm, but his eyes gleamed with something that sent chills down her spine. "You did it, Nina," he said softly. "You stopped it. You saved us all." Nina blinked, trying to make sense of what she had just witnessed. Saved. She shook her head, still trying to piece everything together. But the broadcast, what does it mean? What happens now? The man nodded, his lips tight. The final phase was meant to activate something global, a system that could control and manipulate networks, economies, even governments. You stopped it. You made the right choice. The pilot, standing nearby, exhaled sharply, his shoulders slumping as if a heavy weight had been lifted from him. We weren't supposed to let it go this far. We were trying to stop it too, but you were the only one who could do it. You were the key. Nina turned to the group of men in suits, who were now slowly lowering their weapons. The threat was gone. The danger was over. But the reality was settling in, a cold, hard truth that she wasn't sure she was ready for. "Why me?" Nina asked. "Why was I chosen? Why did I have to do this?" The man in 2B gave her a slight smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "Because, Nina, you've always had a choice. You were never just a passenger on this flight. You were always meant to make the final decision." Nina shook her head in disbelief. She had been caught in something so far beyond her understanding, and yet now, she was somehow the one who had pulled the trigger, who had made the ultimate choice. But in the end, it was over. The threat had been contained. She had saved everyone on the plane. "Is it really over?" Nina whispered. The man in 2B turned to her, his eyes softer now. "For now. But the world has changed. It won't go back to what it was. You have to be ready for that." Nina looked out of the window. The plane had stopped. They were on the ground. The world below seemed so small, so distant. She had just been part of something monumental, something that would change everything. But would anyone ever know what really happened? Would anyone ever understand? "Come on, Nina," the man in Tubi said, his voice low, as if reading her mind. "There's still a long way to go." Nina nodded, unsure of what her future would hold, but certain of one thing. Whatever happened next, she had been the one to make the choice that had stopped it all. She had changed the course of history. And no matter what came next, she would always remember this moment. The moment the world hung in the balance, and she was the one who decided its fate. What do you think of Nina's journey? Was the world saved or just delayed from its fate? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like and share this video with your friends. Where are you watching from? Let's keep the conversation going.